Welcome to this journey of deep knowledge about the dynamics of the economy and the underlying causes of poverty amidst progress. In Progress and Poverty, Henry George offers a revolutionary perspective on the distribution of wealth and how economic injustices affect society. Throughout this audiobook, we will explore the contradictions of the economic system, the laws of wealth distribution, and the proposed solutions for a more equitable future. If this content has been valuable to you, we invite you to subscribe. By doing so, you can continue enjoying more educational audiobooks, delving into topics like economics, history, philosophy, and much more. Your subscription not only guarantees access to more material but also supports the dissemination of this transformative knowledge. Click subscribe and join us on this journey toward a better understanding of the economy and its social impacts. Thank you for listening and learning with us. Chapter 1. Why traditional theories on wages are wrong. In this first chapter of Progress and Poverty, Henry George begins his critique of traditional theories on wages and questions the explanations given about how wages are determined in a capitalist economy. Through this analysis, George establishes the foundations of his alternative economic approach, which focuses on wealth distribution and land ownership as key factors in understanding inequality and poverty amidst economic progress. The traditional view on wages. According to traditional theories, which stem from classical economics, workers' wages depend on several factors, such as the supply and demand for labor, the amount of available capital, and market conditions. It is understood that wages are the price paid for an individual's labor, adjusting based on the supply of workers. If many workers are available, wages decrease, and the demand for labor. If more workers are needed, wages rise. An important part of traditional economic theory is the idea that wages come from capital. According to this view, capital is the basis upon which wages are sustained. In other words, employers use the capital they have accumulated to pay workers, and wages are influenced by the amount of capital available to finance employment. In summary, according to this theory, workers depend on capital to earn their income, and the more capital available, the higher the wages will be. Henry George's critique of the traditional view. Henry George directly challenges the traditional view on wages. First, George criticizes the idea that wages depend solely on supply and demand for labor. According to him, traditional laws that explain wages in this way fail to capture the fundamental causes of wage inequality and the dynamics of exploitation that operate within the capitalist system. George argues that, in reality, wages are not simply the price of labor, as classical theories suggest, but are deeply influenced by the distribution of wealth in society and access to resources. According to him, workers do not receive their wages from capital in the classical sense. Rather, wages depend on the social and economic conditions that create a system of monopoly over the most fundamental resources, land and the means of production. In his critique, George points out that land is a crucial factor that traditional wage theories overlook. In a capitalist society, landowners have power that is not reflected in wage theories, which focus only on labor and capital. Land ownership allows landowners to extract rent from workers and capitalists without directly participating in the production process. According to George, the existence of this land monopoly generates inequality, as workers must pay landowners for the right to work on the land. The impact of land ownership on wages. Marxists and other conventional economists tend to ignore how land ownership directly affects workers' wages. However, Henry George considers the monopoly of land to be the primary cause of poverty, despite progress and capital accumulation. In an economy where land is concentrated in the hands of a few, workers have no access to it, and therefore cannot increase their productivity independently, forcing them to depend on the capitalist for employment. George suggests that, instead of trying to adjust wages solely by manipulating labor supply and demand, it is necessary to address the issue of land distribution. If workers could access land, they could increase their wages without the intervention of capital, as they would be able to produce for themselves or rent land at fair prices. The role of land in the exploitation of labor. The issue of land ownership is also central to the theory of exploitation. George argues that the capitalist system exploits workers not only through the relationship between capital and labor but also through the relationship between labor and land. Capitalists and landowners extract value from workers' labor not only because they own the means of production, but because they control access to land. This control over land leads to structural inequity, as those who have access to land can accumulate wealth from the rent they charge workers, while those without access must sell their labor to survive. Land rent, therefore, is one of the main forms of wealth that accumulates without the landowner participating in production. The solution proposed by Henry George, the land value tax. Henry George argues that the solution to wage inequalities and poverty lies in a profound reform of the land ownership system. He proposes a single tax on land value, meaning that landowners should pay a tax proportional to the value of the land they own. This tax would be used to redistribute wealth, allowing workers to access land without the barriers imposed by landowners. This single tax aims to eliminate land monopolies and allow the wealth generated by natural resources to be shared by all of society, not just a few privileged individuals. According to George, this reform would allow workers' wages to increase, as reducing speculation on land and making it more accessible would enable workers to generate more value independently. Chapter Conclusion. The first chapter of Progress and Poverty is a fierce critique of traditional theories on wages that have dominated classical economics. Henry George demonstrates how land ownership is a key factor in determining wages and perpetuating poverty, even in a growing capitalist system. According to George, traditional solutions that only seek to adjust the supply and demand for labor fail to address the structural problem of inequality in land distribution. George's proposal is bold and revolutionary: a tax on land rent that redistributes wealth and allows workers to access the resources they need to improve their living conditions and increase their wages. This proposal not only questions the foundations of capitalism but also offers a practical solution for creating a fairer and more equitable economy. Chapter 2. Definition of terms. In this chapter, Henry George takes time to clarify and define several key terms that will be essential for understanding the rest of the work. Precision in the use of terms is crucial to understand the critique he makes of traditional economic theories and his own proposals. Throughout this chapter, George establishes the definitions he will use in his arguments about wages, rent, property, and wealth distribution. The meaning of labor. For George, labor is not simply an exchange of time and effort for a wage, as suggested by some traditional theories. According to George, labor has a broader and deeper connotation. Labor is the human ability to transform nature, and its value is not only determined by the time spent on the job but by the value the worker generates through their contribution in the production process. It is important to note that, for George, labor is not just the physical force exerted in an activity but also intellectual work and the skill in organizing production. Labor is, therefore, the source of all value in the economy and should not be reduced simply to a commodity that is bought and sold in a labor market. The concept of capital. Capital is another crucial term that George defines in a way that differs from classical explanations. In traditional theories, capital is any resource used to produce goods and services, which accumulates over time. However, for George, capital has a more important dimension. Capital is the result of wealth accumulation, but this accumulation depends on access to land and natural resources. Capital should not be understood as a form of savings or a simple accumulation of money, but as a productive tool that enables humans to create wealth. In his definition, George emphasizes that capital can only exist if individuals have access to natural resources or land. In this way, capital is directly related to land ownership, which is the primary source of wealth in any economy. Land as a fundamental concept. One of the most important points of this chapter is the definition of land. For George, the term land is not limited to its common meaning of arable land or physical space but has a much broader implication. Land includes all natural resources, minerals, forests, oceans, rivers, arable lands, and all the wealth that nature provides without human intervention. George argues that land is not produced by human labor, but is a resource given by nature, and therefore, its value should not be considered the result of human activity. Rent generated from land is, according to George, a form of exploitation. Those who own the land receive rent without contributing directly to production, simply because they control access to those natural resources. This control of land and its resources is one of the main sources of social and economic inequality in capitalism. The concentration of land in the hands of a few means that a small class of landowners can extract large profits without contributing any labor, while workers must sell their labor to gain access to resources and survive. Rent and its relationship to land. Rent is another key term that George redefines in this chapter. While in traditional economic theory, rent is understood as the payment for the use of land, George goes a step further by stating that rent is not compensation for land use, but a profit that landowners receive without contributing to the productive process. Rent is the value that landowners extract from workers and producers simply because they own the land. This rent, which has no relation to human labor, is a source of exploitation in the capitalist economy, as workers must pay it to access the land and perform their work, but receive nothing in return except permission to work on the land owned by others. Marx also refers to this phenomenon as the appropriation of rent. Instead of natural resources and land being distributed equitably, rent represents the transfer of wealth from workers to landowners, which perpetuates inequality. Interest and its relationship to capital. Another concept that George defines is interest. According to traditional theories, interest is the payment for the use of capital, meaning the compensation for lending money or capital to entrepreneurs. However, George argues that interest is not really a payment for the use of capital, but rather a form of exploitation. George asserts that interest, like rent, is not linked to a contribution to the production process, but is the result of an unequal distribution of wealth. Lenders who receive interest on their capital do not add value to the economy. Instead, they are simply receiving a portion of the wealth generated by workers through production. Interest, for George, is yet another manifestation of the inherent inequalities in capitalism, where owners of capital and land benefit from the wealth generated by the labor of others without actively participating in production. Chapter Conclusion. The second chapter of Progress and Poverty establishes the fundamental definitions that will serve as the basis for the rest of the work. Henry George clarifies the concepts of labor, capital, land, rent, and interest, and shows how each of these terms plays a crucial role in the distribution of wealth and the perpetuation of economic inequalities. Through this chapter, George emphasizes that traditional theories of wages and rent are insufficient to explain the dynamics of capitalism. Wages and rent should not be seen simply as prices adjusted by supply and demand, but as results of an economic system that distributes wealth unequally, favoring land and capital owners at the expense of workers. George prepares to develop his proposal for a fiscal reform that eliminates these inequalities and allows for a fairer distribution of wealth, particularly through a tax on land rent. Chapter 2. Definition of terms. In this chapter, Henry George takes time to clarify and define several key terms that will be essential for understanding the rest of the work. Precision in the use of terms is critical to understand the critique he makes of traditional economic theories and his own proposals. Throughout this chapter, George establishes the definitions he will use in his arguments about wages, rent, property, and wealth distribution. The meaning of labor. For George, labor is not simply an exchange of time and effort for a wage, as suggested by some traditional theories. According to George, labor has a broader and deeper connotation. Labor is the human capacity to transform nature, and its value is not only determined by the time spent on the job but by the value the worker generates through their contribution to the production process. It is important to note that, for George, labor is not just the physical force exerted in an activity but also intellectual work and the skill in organizing production. Labor is, therefore, the source of all value in the economy and should not be reduced simply to a commodity that is bought and sold in a labor market. The concept of capital. Capital is another crucial term that George defines in a way that differs from classical explanations. In traditional theories, capital is any resource used to produce goods and services, which accumulates over time. However, for George, capital has a more important dimension. Capital is the result of wealth accumulation, but this accumulation depends on access to land and natural resources. Capital should not be understood as a form of savings or a simple accumulation of money, but as a productive tool that enables humans to create wealth. In his definition, George emphasizes that capital can only exist if individuals have access to natural resources or land. In this way, capital is directly related to land ownership, which is the primary source of wealth in any economy. Land as a fundamental concept. One of the most important points in this chapter is the definition of land. For George, the term land is not limited to its common meaning of arable land or physical space, but has a much broader implication. Land includes all natural resources, minerals, forests, oceans, rivers, arable lands, and all the wealth nature offers without human intervention. George argues that land is not produced by human labor but is a resource given by nature, and therefore, its value should not be considered the result of human activity. Rent generated from land is, according to George, a form of exploitation. Those who own the land receive rent without contributing directly to production, simply because they control access to those natural resources. This control of land and its resources is one of the main sources of social and economic inequality in capitalism. The concentration of land in the hands of a few means that a small class of landowners can extract large profits without contributing any labor, while workers must sell their labor to gain access to resources and survive. Rent and its relationship to land. Rent is another key term that George redefines in this chapter. While in traditional economic theory, rent is understood as payment for the use of land, George takes it further by asserting that rent is not compensation for land use but rather a profit that landowners receive without contributing to the production process. Rent is the value that landowners extract from workers and producers simply for owning the land. This rent, which has no relation to human labor, is a source of exploitation in the capitalist economy, as workers must pay it in order to access land and do their work, but they receive nothing in return except the permission to work on land that others own. Marx also refers to this phenomenon as the appropriation of rent. Rather than natural resources and land being distributed equitably, rent represents the transfer of wealth from workers to landowners, perpetuating inequality. Interest and its relationship to capital. Another concept that George defines is interest. According to traditional theories, interest is the payment for the use of capital, meaning the compensation for lending money or capital to entrepreneurs. However, George argues that interest is not actually a payment for the use of capital but a form of exploitation. George argues that interest, like rent, is not linked to a contribution to the production process but is the result of an unequal distribution of wealth. Lenders who receive interest on their capital do not add value to the economy. Instead, they are simply receiving a portion of the wealth generated by workers through production. Interest, for George, is yet another manifestation of the inherent inequalities in capitalism, where owners of capital and land benefit from the wealth generated by the labor of others without having to actively participate in production. Chapter Conclusion. The second chapter of Progress and Poverty establishes the fundamental definitions that will serve as the foundation for the rest of the work. Henry George clarifies the concepts of labor, capital, land, rent, and interest, and shows how each of these terms plays a crucial role in the distribution of wealth and the perpetuation of economic inequalities. Through this chapter, George underscores that traditional theories about wages and rent are insufficient to explain the dynamics of capitalism. Wages and rent should not be seen simply as prices adjusted by supply and demand but as results of an economic system that distributes wealth unevenly, favoring landowners and capitalists at the expense of workers. George prepares to develop his proposal for a fiscal reform that eliminates these inequalities and allows for a more just distribution of wealth, particularly through a tax on land rent. Chapter 3. Wages are produced by labor, not derived from capital. In this chapter, Henry George delves into the issue of wages, challenging the traditional view that wages are the result of capital investment. Throughout this chapter, George presents his argument that wages do not depend on the amount of capital available but are the direct result of labor and land productivity. The traditional view of wages. Traditional economic theories hold that workers' wages are determined by the amount of capital available for production. According to this view, entrepreneurs need capital to hire workers and pay their wages. This capital, which may include machinery, infrastructure, or resources, is seen as a means to increase productivity, which in turn generates the wages that workers receive. In the traditional model, wages are a part of the return on capital investment, implying that workers are paid according to the capital employers invest in production. According to this view, when capitalists have more capital available, they can pay better wages to workers, leading to greater overall prosperity. Henry George's critique. George rejects this traditional interpretation. For him, the argument that wages are a consequence of capital is incorrect and does not explain the true dynamics of the capitalist economy. George argues that wages are created directly by labor, not by capital, which he believes plays a secondary role. According to George, labor is the source of all value in the economy. Workers, through their effort and skills, generate value in the production process, and this value is what determines the level of wages. It is not capital that pays workers but the work they perform. In other words, capital is not what creates wages. It is the workers who, through their effort, create the value that translates into wages. The role of capital in production. George does not deny the importance of capital but proposes a different view of its role. Capital, in his definition, is essential for organizing production and efficiency but should not be considered the origin of wages. According to George, capital simply facilitates labor by enabling workers to use tools, machinery, and other resources to increase productivity. However, the creation of wealth remains the result of human labor. In fact, George argues that capital can never generate value on its own. It always depends on human labor to create products that can later be exchanged in the market. This means that capital is a means for workers to produce more, but not the source of wages themselves. Land and the creation of wealth. The key element that George introduces in his argument is land. While traditional economic theories tend to view land as simply another factor of production along with labor and capital, George goes further. He asserts that land is the foundation of production and the creation of wealth. According to George, the relationship between labor and land is what truly generates wages. Workers, by using the land to produce goods, generate the value that translates into wages. Without access to land, workers cannot produce wealth. Therefore, George argues that the unequal distribution of land is what causes inequality in wages. When a small elite controls the land, workers are forced to work for landowners or capitalists, which reduces their income and prevents them from generating wealth on their own. The theory of fair wages. According to George, wages should be more closely related to the productivity of labor and access to land. In an economy where workers had direct access to land and natural resources, they would not only be able to improve their wages but also work more efficiently and justly. Land rent, which is currently received by landowners without having worked to produce it, should be redistributed to support workers and improve their well-being. George argues that, in a capitalist society, the true source of wages lies in the work of individuals, but also in access to natural resources. If workers could own the means of production, including natural resources, their wages would increase, and structural poverty would be eradicated. The impact of land ownership on wages. One of George's fundamental critiques of traditional wage theory is that it does not account for how land ownership affects wages. According to classical theory, workers' wages are based on the supply and demand for labor and the capital available. However, George asserts that the unequal distribution of land has a much greater impact on wages. Workers who do not have access to land must sell their labor to capitalists or landowners. These employers have the power to decide the wages they will pay workers, which often results in low wages, as workers have no other option but to accept the working conditions offered. In contrast, workers who have access to land can generate their own wealth without depending on an employer. Conclusion of the chapter. In this chapter, Henry George reinforces the idea that wages do not depend on capital, as traditional theories suggest, but are a direct consequence of labor and access to land. The true source of wages is the value created by workers through their effort, not the available capital. George also highlights that the unequal distribution of land is one of the main causes of poverty and low wages. If workers had access to land and natural resources, they could increase their wages and improve their living conditions. Land ownership, along with a just system of wealth distribution, is key to eliminating poverty and achieving a more equitable economic system. This chapter lays the foundation for a broader critique of the capitalist system and presents the need for deep reform in the distribution of land and natural resources to ensure that all workers have access to the tools that allow them to thrive. Chapter 4. Workers' sustenance does not come from capital. In this chapter, Henry George directly addresses one of the most erroneous concepts in classical economic theory, the idea that workers depend on capital to sustain themselves. According to traditional theory, workers can only receive wages because capitalists invest capital in production, which enables jobs to be created and workers to receive wages in exchange for their effort. However, George argues that this idea is a fallacy and that workers do not depend on capital to survive. In fact, it is the workers themselves who create the wealth that is later distributed. George critiques the idea that capital is the primary driver behind wages and presents his own theory, which emphasizes labor and access to land as the central elements for understanding wages and the creation of wealth. The fallacy of capital as the source of wages. George begins this chapter by pointing out that traditional economics has misunderstood the role of capital in production. In the classical view, capitalists are seen as the providers of the capital that workers use to produce goods. Capital, in this sense, is viewed as a prior factor that allows workers to create wealth. However, George notes that this is not true. Capital is not the primary source of wages, as mentioned in previous chapters. It is labor that generates value. Workers, by employing their labor in the production process, are the ones who actually create the products that are exchanged in the market. Instead, capital is simply a tool that facilitates and increases labor productivity, but it is not the main cause of wages. For George, wages are the direct result of labor, not capital. Capital, while useful, cannot exist without labor, as it is only through labor that the means of production, such as machinery, buildings, and tools, acquire value and produce goods that can be exchanged in the market. Labor is, therefore, the original source of wealth. Work as the source of wealth. George emphasizes that labor is not only the source of wages but also the source of all wealth. In a capitalist system, human labor is not only used to produce consumer goods but also to produce the added value of products. The value of commodities in the market is determined by the labor invested in them. Through their work, humans transform natural resources into useful products, and it is this transformation process that generates value. Unlike what traditional theories assert, capital is not responsible for creating value. It merely acts as a means to facilitate labor and increase productivity. Therefore, workers are the true creators of wealth, as without their contribution, neither capital nor natural resources could generate value on their own. Land as a key factor in production. In this chapter, George reiterates the importance of land. Although workers are responsible for creating value through their work, access to land is essential for enabling them to produce. Without access to land or without the permission of landowners to work the land, workers cannot generate wealth independently. This reinforces the idea that land, and not capital, is the fundamental resource that workers need to be productive. George critiques the idea that workers depend on capitalists to access the means of production. In his view, land rent is a form of exploitation that restricts access to natural resources and forces workers to sell their labor to gain access to the means of production. The effect of land ownership on wages. One of George's major critiques of the capitalist system is how land ownership is concentrated in the hands of a few, creating economic inequality and directly affecting workers' wages. When a few control the land, workers must pay rent to these owners in order to access it and produce. George argues that if workers had equitable access to land, they could significantly increase their wages without having to depend on capital or capitalists. Land ownership would allow workers to take control of their production, giving them the power to negotiate better working conditions and higher wages. Land ownership and the creation of wealth. George also addresses how land ownership creates a form of rent that is not linked to the production of value. Landowners who possess large amounts of land can collect rent without having participated in the productive process. This rent, which is not the result of labor but of ownership, constitutes a source of passive wealth for landowners. This system creates economic inequality, as landowners receive income without actively contributing to the production process. This contrasts with workers, who, despite being the ones generating value through their labor, do not have control over natural resources, such as land, that could allow them to thrive without depending on an employer. Conclusion of the chapter. In this chapter, Henry George strengthens his critique of traditional theories that claim wages depend on capital. From his perspective, wages do not come from capital but from human labor. Workers are the true creators of wealth, as the value of products comes from their effort. However, land ownership is a crucial factor that limits workers' access to natural resources, reducing their ability to generate wealth independently. George proposes a tax reform where land rent would be taxed, allowing workers to access resources and increase their wages. By freeing up access to land and ending the monopoly of landowners, a more equitable distribution of wealth would be encouraged, and barriers preventing workers from generating more value on their own would be eliminated. This chapter lays the foundation for the solution George proposes in his work, a reform that goes beyond simple wealth redistribution and focuses on land ownership as the key to improving wages and eliminating poverty. Chapter 5. The True Functions of Capital. In this chapter, Henry George addresses the concept of capital and analyzes the true functions it plays in the economy. Throughout the history of economic thought, capital has been viewed in different ways, but George sets out to redefine its role and demystify the traditional view that associates capital exclusively with wealth and the means of production. The traditional view of capital. In traditional economic theories, capital is seen as an essential factor of production that, along with labor and land, is necessary for the production of goods and services. Capital is considered to consist of money, machinery, tools, buildings, and other means of production that capitalists use to invest in labor and generate more products. According to the traditional view, capital is the source of wealth, and entrepreneurs invest this capital to increase productivity and, in turn, pay wages to workers. However, George critiques this traditional view, which sees capital as the basis of wealth, arguing that capital does not generate wealth by itself. For him, capital is simply a tool that facilitates labor but is not the primary source of wages or value creation. Rather than being the engine of the economy, capital depends on more fundamental factors, such as human labor and access to natural resources. Capital as a productivity tool. George explains that capital, in essence, is a means to increase labor productivity. Instead of viewing capital as the source of wealth, he describes it as a tool that allows workers to produce more efficiently. Capital includes machines, tools, factories, and other resources that make human labor more productive, but it is not capital itself that creates wealth. It is the labor that utilizes capital that generates value. According to George, capital only has value to the extent that labor uses it to create products. Without labor, machines and money cannot produce anything. Therefore, capital should be considered a necessary condition for labor, but not the origin of wealth. The role of capitalists in the economy. One of George's central critiques of traditional economic theory is the idea that capitalists are the primary drivers of the economy. According to the classical view, capitalists invest their money in purchasing capital and means of production to hire workers and make profits. This view suggests that entrepreneurs are the creators of wealth by putting capital to work. However, George argues that capitalists do not create wealth. The capitalist merely owns the capital and makes it available to workers, who use it to generate wealth. The capitalist earns profits not because they are contributing to the production process, but because they appropriate a portion of the wealth created by the workers. In other words, the capitalist earns surplus value, profit, from the difference between the value generated by the workers and the wages they are paid. George asserts that capitalists, although playing an important role in organizing production, are not the true creators of wealth. In reality, it is the workers who generate value, while capitalists benefit from the exploitation of labor. The real function of capital in the distribution of wealth. Through this analysis, George questions the distributive function of capital. In traditional economics, it is believed that capital, through its investment in production, generates profits that are distributed between capitalists and workers. However, George argues that capital does not generate wealth, nor does it have a distributive function on its own. In fact, what capital really distributes is the rent paid for land and natural resources. Capital, being closely linked to land ownership, allows landowners to benefit from a rent that does not come from production or labor but from the possession of a scarce resource. According to George, land rent is a form of exploitation that contributes to economic inequality. The truth about capital accumulation. One of the key points George addresses in this chapter is the accumulation of capital. Traditional theory holds that capital accumulates when entrepreneurs invest their profits into the production of more capital, which leads to economic growth. However, George points out that capital accumulation is not the true cause of economic progress. The true cause of economic progress lies in improvements in production techniques and access to land. Economic growth and wage increases do not depend on capital accumulation, but on the ability of workers to produce more value through new tools, technologies, and production methods. Capital accumulation cannot guarantee general prosperity, as if it is not distributed fairly and equitably, it can lead to the concentration of wealth and social inequality. Capital and land ownership. A recurring theme in Henry George's works is the crucial role of land in the economy. In this chapter, George once again points out that land ownership is the foundation upon which capital is accumulated and that capital can only be productive if there is access to land. Without land, neither labor nor capital could generate wealth. Land rent, which is the portion of the value generated by workers that is appropriated by the landowner, is not a profit derived from labor or capital but is a non-productive gain that reinforces social inequalities. Landowners, by controlling natural resources, extract wealth without having worked to generate it. This concentration of land ownership in the hands of a few is one of the main causes of poverty, as workers cannot access the necessary resources to generate wealth independently. Conclusion of the chapter. In this chapter, Henry George redefines the concept of capital and clarifies its true function in the economy. Throughout his analysis, George shows that capital is not the primary source of wealth or the engine of the economy but is a productive tool that depends on labor to generate value. Furthermore, he highlights that capital accumulation does not guarantee economic progress, as it is deeply tied to the unequal distribution of natural resources. George also points out that land ownership is the key factor that allows capitalists to obtain wealth without contributing to production. Land rent is a form of exploitation that prevents workers from fully benefiting from their labor. This chapter lays the foundation for George's proposed reform, which aims to transform the distribution of land and natural resources, eliminating exploitation and promoting a more equitable economy. Chapter 6. Malthus's Theory of Population. In this chapter, Henry George addresses Thomas Malthus's theory of population, one of the most influential economists of the 18th and 19th centuries. Malthus is known for his theory that human population grows geometrically, while available resources, especially food, grow arithmetically. According to Malthus, this discrepancy in the growth rate of population and resources leads to an inevitable food shortage and, therefore, poverty and suffering for the lower classes of society. George examines and critiques this theory, noting that while Malthus observed certain realities in the relationship between population and resources, his conclusion that poverty is an inevitable result of population growth is erroneous. According to George, the true cause of poverty is not population growth itself, but the unequal distribution of wealth, especially the control of natural resources such as land. Malthus's theory of population. Malthus's theory is based on the idea that population grows exponentially, while food production can only grow at a linear rate. According to Malthus, when the population increases, the supply of food and resources cannot keep up at the same pace, leading to food shortages. This, in turn, results in misery and social inequality, as limited resources cannot support all members of the population. Malthus believed that this cycle of overpopulation and resource scarcity was inevitable, and thus, poverty and the struggle for basic resources were natural and unavoidable conditions of human life. According to him, policies aimed at improving the living conditions of the poor would only perpetuate the problem, as they would increase the population without increasing the available resources. Henry George's critique of Malthus's theory. Henry George does not completely reject Malthus's observations on the relationship between population and resources, but he criticizes his conclusion that poverty is an inevitable fate. George argues that Malthus misdirected his analysis by blaming population itself for poverty and suffering. Rather than being a natural phenomenon, George believes poverty is the result of the unjust distribution of resources. George highlights that land, which Malthus overlooks in his analysis, is the key resource that determines the well-being of the population. The inequality in land ownership is the true cause of poverty, not population growth. Natural resources, such as land, are not limited in the same way food production is, but are instead poorly distributed. Population growth and access to land. George argues that if all individuals had access to land and natural resources, the population could grow without increasing poverty. Instead of limiting population growth, as Malthus proposed as a solution to poverty, George suggests that redistributing land and granting workers access to resources would allow production to grow at the same rate as the population, thus eliminating resource scarcity and poverty. George asserts that in a society where everyone could access land and participate fully in production, workers could generate enough wealth to support themselves and their families, regardless of population growth. This redistribution of land would allow for a prosperous and balanced society, no matter how quickly the population grew. Malthus's error on resource scarcity. George points out that the concept of scarcity in Malthus's theory is incorrect because it does not account for the role of property. While natural resources may be abundant and sufficient to sustain a growing population, their concentration in the hands of a few is what generates poverty and inequality. Malthus did not recognize that the scarcity of resources is not an inevitable consequence of population growth, but a result of the unequal distribution of land. According to George, if natural resources were distributed equitably, there would be no scarcity. In fact, in many cases, the land's capacity to generate resources could be much greater than Malthus considered, especially when technological advances and improvements in productive efficiency are taken into account, which increase the land's ability to support a growing population. George's solution to poverty and overpopulation. George proposes a radical reform in land ownership as the solution to poverty and resource scarcity. Instead of limiting population or restricting its growth, George suggests that land should be owned by all, and that landowners should pay a tax on land rent, which would redistribute resources more equitably. This land rent tax would eliminate land speculation, reduce the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, and allow workers to access land, improving their living conditions and increasing their wages. In such a system, poverty would disappear, as everyone would have access to the resources necessary to prosper. Conclusion of the chapter. In this chapter, Henry George offers a deep critique of Malthus's theory on the relationship between population and resources. While acknowledging that population growth may present challenges in terms of resources, George refutes the idea that poverty is an inevitable consequence of population growth. Instead, George proposes that the unequal distribution of land and natural resources is the true cause of poverty, and that a reform in land ownership could eliminate resource scarcity and ensure the well-being of the population, regardless of its size. George's proposal is clear: equitable access to land is the key to solving poverty and ensuring that all members of society can prosper, regardless of the population growth rate. Chapter 7. Malthus versus Facts. In this chapter, Henry George directly criticizes Thomas Malthus's population theory, challenging his claims with historical facts and real economic developments that have occurred since Malthus formulated his theory. George argues that, contrary to Malthus's predictions, population growth has not led to a general worsening of living conditions for most people, and that resource scarcity is not the fundamental problem. On the contrary, Malthus's theories failed to predict how wealth distribution and access to land ownership directly affect people's lives. Malthus's prediction on poverty. According to Malthus's theory, population growth should have led to a chronic shortage of food and resources, which would have worsened the living conditions of the general population. Malthus predicted that improvements in agriculture and production would not be enough to sustain a rapidly growing population, and as a result, poverty, hunger, and misery would increase. However, George refutes this prediction with historical facts from the Industrial Revolution and other economic developments that, contrary to Malthus's predictions, did not lead to a proportional increase in poverty. As agricultural productivity and production capacity increased, the capitalist system did not lead to greater resource scarcity, but to changes in social and economic structures that, despite their inequalities, allowed many more people to access better living conditions than Malthus had anticipated. The case of the Industrial Revolution. George points out that the Industrial Revolution was a historical event that disproved Malthus's predictions about the future of population and resource scarcity. As agricultural technology and industrial innovations advanced, the production of food and goods increased exponentially. Instead of experiencing the scarcity predicted by Malthus, the living conditions of many people improved, and the wealth generated by human labor allowed for an expansion of the middle class and social progress. Technology and the organization of labor not only increased the production of material goods but also led to an increase in the capacity of natural resources to support a growing population. The problem was not an absolute limit of resources, as Malthus suggested, but a problem of the unequal distribution of those resources. Capitalist societies developed the ability to support a larger population, but landowners and capitalists continued to concentrate wealth in their hands, preventing resources from being used for the benefit of the majority. Population growth and technological progress. George also criticizes Malthus's approach to population growth, suggesting that Malthus did not account for the impact of technological progress and social organization on productivity. As the population grew, so did humanity's capacity to produce goods and services more efficiently. Unlike Malthus, George points out that technological improvements and innovations in the organization of labor not only increased the quantity of goods produced but also improved the quality of life for many people. More advanced farming techniques, the mechanization of industry, and infrastructure development contributed to an increase in overall wealth, rather than resource scarcity. George argues that Malthus's theory failed to foresee how human creativity and innovation would allow problems of scarcity to be overcome rather than worsened. In this sense, Malthus's predictions were too pessimistic and overlooked the human potential to increase production and well-being. The real cause of poverty: wealth distribution. George argues that poverty is not the result of overpopulation or resource scarcity, but of the poor distribution of wealth. While Malthus viewed population as the cause of poverty, George contends that access to land and natural resources is the key factor. The real cause of poverty is the concentration of land ownership in the hands of a few, which limits workers' access to the resources necessary to generate wealth. By centralizing land ownership and other natural resources, the upper classes and landowners control the majority of wealth and resources, while workers must sell their labor to capitalists or landowners to survive. This structural inequality is what causes poverty, not population growth. Facts disprove Malthus's theory. George uses a series of historical facts and statistics to disprove Malthus's theory. The progress of humanity, in terms of food production, technology, and access to resources, has shown that poverty is not the result of unchecked population growth, but of an economic system that concentrates land and resource ownership in the hands of a few. Population growth has not led to a decrease in resources, but to a greater ability to utilize them more efficiently. Persistent poverty is largely due to the exclusive ownership of land, which limits workers' ability to use resources to their advantage. Conclusion of the chapter. This chapter is a direct refutation of Malthus's predictions, based on historical facts and technological progress, to demonstrate that Malthus's theories about poverty and scarcity are incorrect. George emphasizes that the real cause of poverty is not population growth, but the unequal distribution of land and natural resources. George's analysis suggests that, instead of limiting population or seeking ways to control it, the solution to poverty lies in reforming the land ownership system and allowing everyone access to the resources needed to thrive. With a more equitable distribution of resources, poverty could be eliminated regardless of the size of the population. Chapter 8. Malthus versus Analogies. In this chapter, Henry George focuses on the analogies used by Thomas Malthus to justify his theory on population and resources. Malthus, to explain his ideas, uses a series of analogies, particularly the biological analogy of living organisms and their relationship to population growth and resource availability. George challenges the validity of these analogies, arguing that the same biological reasoning cannot be applied to human societies and that, by doing so, Malthus falls into a logical and conceptual error. Malthus's biological analogy. Malthus relies on the biological analogy to argue that the human population tends to grow geometrically, i.e., doubling constantly, while resources, such as food, grow only arithmetically, i.e., in a linear manner. This difference in the rates of population and resource growth would be the cause of food scarcity and, therefore, poverty and suffering in societies. For Malthus, the situation is similar to that of a biological species whose number of individuals grows faster than the resources necessary for its survival. By applying this analogy, Malthus concludes that, sooner or later, the population will reach the limit of available resources, leading to an overpopulation crisis, where natural laws, such as hunger, war, or disease, would reduce the population. George criticizes the biological analogy. George refutes this analogy, arguing that human society is not comparable to a biological organism. While in the natural world organisms tend to reproduce faster than their resources can support, human society does not follow the same biological laws. Humans have the ability to modify their environment, allowing them to overcome natural limitations through technological innovation, social organization, and economic policies. George argues that humanity's ability to transform nature through technology and labor has no parallel in the biological realm. Humans are not subject to the same natural laws as biology, as their capacity to produce food and resources increases as new technologies are developed and social and economic organization improves. Rather than being limited by a biological cycle of scarcity, humans can overcome these limitations through cooperation, knowledge exchange, and improvements in productive conditions. Malthus's error in ignoring innovation and progress. George criticizes Malthus for failing to recognize the role of human progress in his analysis. According to Malthus, population growth is inevitable and will lead to scarcity. However, George argues that technological progress and human capacity to improve production allow resources to increase over time, even as the population grows. In other words, humanity has the potential to increase available resources much faster and more efficiently than Malthus had predicted. By ignoring this crucial aspect, Malthus becomes trapped in a pessimistic view of humanity, seeing progress only as a temporary solution rather than as a continuous process that can ease the tensions between population and resources. Malthus's view does not account for human adaptability or its ability to find new technological and organizational solutions to resource problems. Exploitation of land and poverty. George also points out that the main factor causing scarcity is not population growth, but the unequal distribution of natural resources, especially land ownership. While Malthus focused on resources as a whole, George argues that land ownership is what truly limits workers' access to the resources they need to produce more. In an economy where natural resources are controlled by a few landowners, workers cannot access land to produce independently. This creates a false scarcity, as land is an abundant and available resource, but it is not distributed equitably. At the same time, landowners earn rent without contributing to production, which perpetuates inequalities and poverty in society. The role of technology and innovation in resource production. A crucial aspect that George introduces in his critique is humanity's potential to increase resource production through technological innovation. Modern technology has allowed for the creation of more efficient farming methods, as well as the more productive utilization of natural resources. In fact, humanity has historically overcome the limitations of natural resources through technological advances, from agriculture to industry. As new production techniques are developed and technological processes are improved, humanity's ability to generate wealth also increases, challenging Malthus's idea that poverty is an inevitable consequence of population growth. The solution: land ownership reform. George concludes that the true solution to poverty is not limiting population growth or addressing resource scarcity, but reforming the land ownership system. Instead of a few landowners controlling natural resources, George proposes that land be redistributed so that all workers have access to it and can generate wealth for themselves. This would eliminate land rent, a system that currently extracts wealth without productive contributions and contributes to economic inequality. By allowing workers access to land, George believes the problems of poverty and scarcity would be solved without resorting to population control policies. Instead of trying to curb population growth, as Malthus suggests, the real solution is to ensure that all individuals have equitable access to the resources necessary for a prosperous life. Conclusion of the chapter. In this chapter, Henry George reinforces his critique of Malthus's theory, especially the analogies he used to support his view on the relationship between population and resources. George dismantles Malthus's biological analogy and argues that resource scarcity is neither inevitable nor a natural consequence of population growth. On the contrary, technological progress and a more equitable distribution of land are key to solving poverty and inequality. By eliminating the barriers created by the concentration of land in the hands of a few and promoting universal access to resources, George proposes a practical and humanitarian solution to poverty that does not rely on curbing population growth but on reforming economic structures regarding land ownership. Chapter 9. Malthusian Theory Refuted. In this chapter, Henry George offers a final critique of the Malthusian theory on population growth and its relationship with resource scarcity. George argues that Thomas Malthus's theory, which posits that population growth inevitably exceeds available resources, has been refuted by historical facts and economic developments that do not align with Malthus's predictions. Throughout this chapter, George explains how technological advancements and improvements in resource distribution can counter the threats of overpopulation and scarcity that Malthus predicted. Malthus's theory and his predictions. Thomas Malthus proposed that while human population grows geometrically, doubling every certain number of years, resources, especially food, only grow arithmetically, much more slowly. Malthus predicted that this would lead to a scarcity of food and resources as the population increased, resulting in famines, diseases, and wars as a natural way to reduce the population to match the available resources. This theory, based on the idea that humanity is doomed to face resource limitations as its population grows, influenced many economic policies of the time, including those that limited aid to the poor and favored the iron law of wages, according to which workers' wages could never rise above a minimum level due to competition from a growing population. George's refutation: technological progress and resource abundance. George forcefully refutes Malthus's theory by pointing out that the predictions of scarcity that Malthus made have not come true in recent history. Instead of facing a population crisis, humanity has been able to generate more food and resources as the population has grown, thanks to technological advancements, improvements in agricultural techniques, and the development of new production methods. George highlights that technology has allowed for more efficient production of food and goods. The mechanization of agriculture has enabled a growing population to produce more with less effort, and technological innovations have opened new ways of using natural resources more efficiently. For example, the use of fertilizers, advanced irrigation, and agricultural machinery has greatly increased agricultural yields, allowing the growing demand for food to be met even with an increasing population. George emphasizes that technological improvements have not only increased food production but also the production of other essential goods for human well-being, such as housing, energy, and services. In summary, the resource scarcity that Malthus predicted has not occurred. Instead, human productive capacity has increased, counteracting the supposed natural limitations. The true cause of poverty: unequal distribution of resources. George does not deny that population growth can create economic pressures, but he rejects the idea that poverty and misery are the result of a natural limitation of resources. According to George, the unequal distribution of wealth and natural resources is the true cause of poverty. Land, the most basic and essential resource for production, is in the hands of a few, while many workers lack access to land to produce food and goods for their own sustenance. Instead of seeking to limit population growth, as Malthusian theories suggest, George proposes a reform in land ownership. According to his proposal, a tax on land rents would allow for a more equitable redistribution of resources, eliminating the economic barriers that prevent workers from accessing natural resources. This way, the limitations of poverty could be overcome without having to resort to drastic population control measures. Historical facts: population growth and resource abundance. George points out that Malthus's predictions about resource scarcity due to population growth have not materialized. From the Industrial Revolution to the present day, global production of food and goods has increased to meet the needs of a constantly growing population. As technology has advanced, humanity's capacity to produce enough to sustain the population has also increased. Throughout history, human societies have demonstrated an ability to adapt and progress that Malthus had not foreseen. Every time the population has grown, humanity has responded with new productive solutions that have increased the supply of resources and ensured that everyone had access to what was necessary for survival. Humanity has used its intelligence and innovative capacity to overcome the natural limitations that Malthus thought were inevitable. The solution: reforming land ownership. George proposes that the solution to poverty and resource overload lies not in population control but in the reform of land ownership. The equitable redistribution of land and a tax system based on land rent would allow all workers to access the resources needed to generate wealth independently. Redistributing land would not only alleviate economic tensions between social classes but also enable the economy to grow more equitably, benefiting the majority rather than a few landowners. This would eliminate the barriers preventing workers from accessing land and increase their wages, which in turn would lead to an overall improvement in the well-being of society as a whole. Conclusion of the chapter. In this chapter, Henry George directly challenges Malthus's theory, demonstrating that the predictions of overpopulation and resource scarcity have not materialized in reality. Instead of being an inevitable consequence of population growth, poverty and inequality are the result of poor resource distribution, particularly land ownership. George uses historical facts and technological advances to refute Malthusian theory and demonstrates that the solution to poverty lies not in limiting population growth, but in reforming the economic structures that perpetuate social inequality. The redistribution of land and equitable access to resources are the true solution to achieving a prosperous and just society, regardless of population size. Chapter 10. Necessary relationship of distribution laws. In this chapter, Henry George explores the relationship between the laws of wealth distribution and the fundamental economic laws that operate within society. Throughout his argument, George attempts to explain how distribution laws are not simply the result of market forces or competition, but are deeply influenced by social and political factors, especially the system of land ownership. The laws of distribution and their impact on society. George begins this chapter by explaining that the laws of distribution, i.e., the laws that determine how wealth is distributed among social classes, are crucial for understanding economic inequalities. For him, the laws of distribution are not the result of natural laws of competition, but are the product of social and political decisions. Historically, these decisions have favored landowners and capitalists while leaving workers and lower classes in a state of exploitation and inequality. George rejects the idea that the distribution of wealth is simply a reflection of free competition between individuals. Instead, he argues that the laws of distribution are determined by the existing economic and social structure. In particular, land ownership plays a key role in inequality. While market competition can influence the distribution of certain goods and services, land ownership is the factor that truly determines the distribution of the most fundamental resources. Land ownership as a determining factor. For George, land ownership not only defines wealth but also defines economic power within society. When natural resources are controlled by a few landowners, they can extract rent from all those who depend on land to produce goods and services. This process is not the result of productivity or labor, but simply the possession of a scarce and essential resource, land. George argues that land rent is a type of unproductive income, meaning it is a gain that does not come from labor or investment in the productive process, but from the mere possession of a limited natural resource. Therefore, landowners receive rent without having to work to earn it. This rent becomes one of the primary sources of economic inequality and, as a result, contributes to the exploitation of workers, who must pay this rent to access the resources necessary for production. Capital and property in the capitalist system. George also addresses the role of capital in the distribution of wealth. While capital is important for increasing productivity and improving production efficiency, George maintains that, ultimately, capital is not the source of wealth, but rather a means for landowners and capitalists to exploit workers. Capital is used to increase production, but land ownership remains the key factor determining who receives the majority of the wealth generated. The accumulation of capital by entrepreneurs and capitalists can increase productivity, but this does not necessarily lead to a more equitable distribution of wealth. In fact, the concentration of property, both capital and land, in the hands of a few contributes to growing social inequality. Instead of capital being used to raise wages and improve the living conditions of workers, it is concentrated in the hands of the rich, who use it to exploit workers further. The need for reform in distribution laws. The central argument George makes in this chapter is that the current distribution laws are unjust and are deeply distorted by the land ownership system. To correct this injustice, George advocates for a profound reform in land ownership that would allow all individuals to access the resources necessary to thrive. The redistribution of land through a land rent tax would allow for a more equitable distribution of wealth and, at the same time, eliminate the barriers that prevent workers from accessing resources. George proposes that by imposing a land rent tax, landowners would stop receiving income without having worked to generate it. This reform would reduce the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few and provide the resources needed to improve the living conditions of workers. By eliminating the economic barriers created by exclusive land ownership, workers could access resources more fairly, thus raising their wages and improving their quality of life. The impact of reform on society. George also emphasizes that a reform in distribution laws would not only benefit workers but also have positive effects for society as a whole. By ensuring more equitable access to land and resources, society would experience greater economic stability, improved living standards, and a reduction in social tensions. The reform would also reduce violence and social protests that arise when the lower classes feel exploited and marginalized. Conclusion of the chapter. In this chapter, Henry George argues that the laws of wealth distribution are the result of an unjust economic system, where land ownership is concentrated in the hands of a few landowners. This concentration of economic power is the primary cause of social inequality, as landowners can extract rent from workers without participating in production. George proposes that reforming the distribution laws through the implementation of a land rent tax is the key to solving poverty and inequality. By allowing equitable access to natural resources and eliminating the exploitation of workers, this reform would generate a more just and prosperous society for all. Chapter 11. The Law of Rent. In this chapter, Henry George introduces and explains the law of rent, a central concept in his work. According to George, the law of rent establishes that the value generated from land is not the result of labor or capital but of the monopoly on land ownership. Land rent, which is the portion of value produced by labor, is a gain without work that is received simply for owning land. This system of rent is one of the main causes of economic inequality and poverty, as it concentrates wealth in the hands of landowners, while workers, who actually produce wealth, must work to gain access to natural resources. The nature of rent. George begins the chapter by explaining what rent is and how it is generated. According to George, rent is the income that landowners receive simply by owning land. This rent does not come from capital investment or human labor, but is a passive gain that landowners receive from controlling a limited and essential resource, land. Therefore, rent is not the result of labor but of the exclusive ownership of a limited natural resource. Workers, for their part, create value through their labor, but the significant portion of that value is diverted to landowners in the form of rent. According to George, this rent is unjust because it is not the result of any productive effort, but of the possession of a natural resource. Rent as a source of inequality. George emphasizes that the law of rent is one of the main causes of economic inequality in the capitalist system. Rent generates a concentration of wealth in the hands of a few landowners who do not have to do anything to earn money other than own land. This concentration of wealth creates an economic gap between landowners and workers who must pay rent to access land and, therefore, generate wealth that benefits the landowners. Landowners, by receiving rent from the land, enjoy passive income without having to contribute actively to production. Meanwhile, workers who effectively produce wealth through their labor not only receive low wages but must pay a significant portion of their income to landowners as rent. This situation creates a relationship of exploitation and perpetuates poverty and inequality. Rent as a non-productive income. George makes a clear distinction between productive income and non-productive income. Productive income comes directly from labor and capital investment in the production of goods and services. On the other hand, non-productive income comes not from work or investment in production, but from the mere ownership of a limited resource, such as land. Land rent is a clear example of non-productive income. Landowners are not contributing to the productive process, but they benefit from the scarcity of land and their exclusive ownership. Therefore, land rent is not a product of labor, but of control over a scarce natural resource. George argues that this type of income is unjust because it is not the result of human effort or productive investment. The law of rent and the accumulation of capital. Another aspect that George addresses is the relationship between rent and the accumulation of capital. According to traditional economic theory, workers' wages and capitalists' profits depend on the accumulation of capital. However, George argues that the accumulation of capital is not the main driver of the economy, but rather land ownership determines the flow of resources and the distribution of wealth. The rent that landowners receive from land ownership becomes an obstacle to the accumulation of capital. Instead of investing in production and improving workers' living conditions, landowners benefit simply by owning land, which leads to an unequal distribution of resources and a lack of incentives to invest in productivity. George maintains that if land rent were eliminated or more equitably redistributed, resources could be invested more efficiently, increasing productivity and improving workers' living conditions. The solution to rent, a land rent tax. George's proposed solution to the injustice represented by rent is a land rent tax. He suggests that, rather than allowing landowners to receive passive profits from their property, they should be taxed based on the value of the land they own. This tax would redistribute wealth more equitably and eliminate the exploitation system that allows landowners to grow rich without contributing to the productive process. The land rent tax would also incentivize landowners to use land more productively, as the tax would be based on the value of the land rather than the income generated by production. This would encourage a better distribution of resources and greater investments in production, benefiting both workers and society as a whole. Rent and the social solution. George concludes the chapter by stating that land rent is a fundamental social and economic problem. The exclusive ownership of land allows a few individuals to extract wealth without contributing to production, creating inequality and poverty. To address this issue, it is necessary to reform the ownership system and ensure that natural resources are available to all. By imposing a land rent tax, society could redistribute wealth, eliminate the economic barriers that prevent workers from accessing resources, and create a fairer and more equitable economy. This change would not only improve workers' living conditions but also foster a more prosperous and balanced society, where wealth is distributed according to effort and labor, not the possession of limited resources. Chapter Conclusion. The law of rent, according to Henry George, is one of the main causes of economic inequality in capitalist societies. The rent that landowners receive simply for owning land is not a productive income and contributes to the exploitation of workers. George proposes that the solution to this problem is a land rent tax, which would redistribute wealth more equitably and allow workers to access the natural resources needed for production. This chapter reinforces George's criticism of the land ownership system, highlighting how the concentration of ownership in the hands of a few landowners perpetuates poverty and inequality, while the redistribution of land would be the key to solving these social and economic problems. Chapter 12. The Cause of Interest. In this chapter, Henry George addresses the concept of interest, which in traditional economic theory is considered the payment made to lenders for the use of capital. According to classical theory, lenders receive interest as a reward for lending their capital to entrepreneurs who need it for production. However, George challenges this traditional explanation and proposes an alternative view, arguing that interest is not simply a legitimate payment for the use of capital, but a form of exploitation linked to the inequalities of the capitalist system. The traditional theory of interest. The traditional theory of interest, influenced by economists like David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, holds that interest is compensation for the use of capital. According to this perspective, when a lender lends money to an entrepreneur, the money is used to finance production, which generates a return in the form of profits. The lender receives a portion of that profit as interest for lending the capital necessary for the production process. This view treats interest as a legitimate payment made for the use of capital. According to classical theory, the scarcer the available capital, the higher the interest, as lenders can demand higher compensation for the use of their money. Additionally, interest is seen as an incentive for savers to lend their capital to entrepreneurs, which in turn promotes economic growth. George's critique: interest is not payment for the use of capital. George refutes the traditional theory by stating that interest is not a legitimate payment for the use of capital. According to him, interest is not generated by investment or the use of capital in production, but originates from the exploitation of the working class. The true cause of interest, according to George, is not the scarcity of capital or the use of money in production, but the concentration of land ownership and control of natural resources. George argues that interest is actually a non-productive gain that lenders receive without contributing to the production process. Capital, rather than being the cause of interest, simply serves as a means by which capitalists exploit the labor of workers. Lenders and capitalists earn interest not because their money is directly contributing to the creation of value, but because they control resources essential for production and can appropriate part of the wealth created by workers. Interest as a form of exploitation. George goes further by arguing that interest, like land rent, is a form of exploitation that is not linked to productivity or human labor. Lenders do not contribute to the production process but benefit from the work of the workers through the interest they charge for the use of their capital. This system creates economic inequality, as capitalists enrich themselves without actively participating in the creation of value. Interest, in this sense, is a transfer of wealth from workers to capitalists. Workers produce the value, but part of that value is directed to capitalists as interest, reducing the workers' share of the wealth they themselves generate. This dynamic perpetuates inequality in capitalist society, as wealth concentrates in the hands of a few lenders and landowners, while workers, who generate most of the wealth, are forced to work for low wages. The connection between land rent and interest, parallels and similarities. George also draws a parallel between land rent and interest, arguing that both are forms of non-productive income that do not arise from labor or investment in the production process. Like land rent, interest is a form of passive gain that is not linked to human effort but derives from the control of scarce resources. Both rent and interest are examples of how the capitalist system allows owners of scarce goods, such as land and capital, to receive income without directly contributing to the production process. These forms of profit not only create economic inequalities but also perpetuate the exploitation of workers who lack access to the necessary resources to generate wealth independently. The solution: reform of the property system and a land tax. Just as with land rent, George proposes that the solution to the problem of interest is a profound reform of the property system. According to George, the system of land and capital ownership allows a few to benefit from the exploitation of the labor of others. To address these inequalities, George advocates for a land rent tax, which would redistribute resources more equitably and allow workers to access the natural resources necessary for independent production. This land rent tax would also have the effect of eliminating rent and interest as forms of non-productive profit, as natural resources would be distributed more equitably and workers would have greater access to land. This would not only improve the living conditions of workers but also promote more sustainable and fair economic growth based on production rather than speculation on scarce resources. Interest and economic justice. George concludes that interest, like land rent, is a manifestation of the injustices inherent in the capitalist system. Both are examples of how natural resources, such as land and capital, are controlled by a few, allowing the rich to benefit without contributing to the production process. The real solution to these problems is reform that removes the barriers created by the concentration of ownership and allows all individuals to access natural resources fairly, which would in turn eliminate economic injustices and improve the distribution of wealth. Chapter Conclusion. In this chapter, Henry George strengthens his critique of the traditional theory of interest, arguing that interest is not the result of the legitimate use of capital, but a form of exploitation arising from the concentration of ownership of natural resources. Like land rent, interest is a non-productive gain derived from the control of a scarce resource without directly contributing to value creation. George proposes a fiscal reform in which landowners and capitalists would pay a tax on land rent, redistributing resources and allowing for greater economic equity. This reform would not only eliminate exploitation but also foster a more sustainable and just economy. Chapter 13. False Interest. In this chapter, Henry George continues his critique of the concept of interest in the capitalist economic system, addressing what he calls false interest. George argues that interest, as understood in traditional economic theory, does not truly reflect the value generated by labor or productive investment, but is the result of an economic system that perpetuates inequalities and exploitation. Instead of being a legitimate reward for the use of capital, interest in capitalism is a form of non-productive profit that benefits lenders and capitalists at the expense of workers. Interest as an unjust exploitation. George begins this chapter by noting that interest is not the result of a productive process, as claimed in traditional theories. While in conventional thought, interest is understood as legitimate compensation received by lenders for the use of their money or capital, George maintains that this concept of interest is a false interest, as it does not derive from labor or the production of goods and services. True interest should be the payment corresponding to a productive investment that benefits all participants in the economic process. However, in capitalism, interest does not come from labor or investment in production, but from a passive gain that lenders obtain simply from controlling resources, especially through the ownership of land and capital. The discrepancy between labor and interest. George explains that capital is only useful for production when used in combination with labor, i.e., when workers use capital, tools, machinery, etc., to generate products. Labor is the primary source of value, and capital is merely a tool that facilitates production. Therefore, interest should be a reward for the productive contribution of capital through labor, but this is not the case in the capitalist system. False interest, according to George, is a form of profit derived from ownership of the means of production, especially land, which is concentrated in the hands of a few landowners and capitalists. These owners do not directly contribute to production but receive continuous payment for the use of their resources, which is known as interest. This interest is not the result of productive labor, but rather a form of exploitation of the workers, who are the ones that truly generate value. Interest as a form of non-productive income. George makes a clear distinction between productive income and non-productive income. Productive income comes directly from the creation of goods and services through labor and investment in production. Non-productive income, on the other hand, is obtained without directly contributing to the production process. Interest falls into the category of non-productive income, as lenders receive money for controlling resources, not for labor or for creating value. This type of income is not related to wealth creation through human effort. Capitalists and landowners obtain their wealth simply by owning scarce resources, such as land, without actively participating in production. This passive income is not a reward for productive investment but a form of appropriation of value generated by the labor of others. False interest and the capitalist system. The capitalist system, according to George, is designed to benefit the owners of capital and land, allowing them to extract unfair interest from the labor of others. While workers create value through their labor, lenders and landowners receive a portion of that value without having worked to produce it. This false interest perpetuates inequality and exploitation, as workers do not receive all the wealth they produce, with a significant portion being allocated to lenders and landowners as interest. The accumulation of capital and the concentration of land ownership allow the rich to benefit from non-productive profits while workers continue to receive low wages. This system perpetuates a cycle of exploitation, where workers must pay a portion of their income in the form of interest to lenders, while landowners receive rent without contributing to production. The solution: redistribution of land and elimination of false interest. To address the problem of false interest and exploitation in the capitalist system, George proposes a reform of land and capital ownership. Instead of allowing lenders and landowners to benefit from the exclusive ownership of natural resources, George suggests that resources should be redistributed more equitably. The redistribution of land and the tax on land rent would allow workers to access natural resources and generate wealth independently, without having to pay excessive rent or be subject to the exploitation of capitalists. This reform would eliminate false interest, allowing workers to retain a greater portion of the wealth they generate. Furthermore, eliminating false interest would allow production to be based on labor and innovation rather than the ownership of resources. George argues that a system based on productive labor and access to natural resources would be fairer and more beneficial to society as a whole. Chapter Conclusion. In this chapter, Henry George dismantles the traditional notion of interest as legitimate compensation for the use of capital. According to his view, interest is not a reward for labor or productive investment, but a form of non-productive profit derived from the ownership of land and natural resources. Interest is a manifestation of exploitation in the capitalist system, which allows capitalists and landowners to enrich themselves without contributing to the productive process. George proposes a profound reform of the economic system, eliminating false interest through a tax on land rent, ensuring that natural resources are distributed more equitably and removing barriers that prevent workers from accessing resources. According to George, this reform would allow for a more just distribution of wealth and eradicate the exploitation of workers, creating a more equitable and prosperous society for all. Chapter 14. The Law of Interest. In this chapter, Henry George analyzes and presents his own theory of interest. Throughout the text, George delves into the roots of interest and offers a completely different perspective from traditional theory, which views interest as legitimate compensation for the use of capital. While classical theory holds that interest is a reward for the temporary sacrifice of capital and the risk assumed by lenders, George argues that interest has no legitimate basis in production. Rather, it is a form of speculative profit derived from an unequal property system, especially the ownership of land. The traditional explanation of interest. According to classical economics, interest is the payment made to lenders for the use of their capital. Capital, in this case, is considered a commodity that is rented for a specific period. The lender temporarily provides their money to entrepreneurs in exchange for compensation, which is the interest. This payment is justified, in traditional views, as a reward for foregoing immediate consumption, sacrificing money, and for the risks associated with investment. Moreover, in traditional theories of interest, it is assumed that capital is essential for the production of goods, and that the payment of interest is necessary to incentivize lenders to provide their money to entrepreneurs. If capital is scarce, interest will be higher, and if it is abundant, interest will be lower. This is the commonly accepted explanation for how interest is determined. George's critique. Interest is not the result of productive investment. George begins his critique by pointing out that interest is not actually a reward for the use of capital in a productive process. According to his view, capital does not create value by itself. Rather, labor is the source of all value. Workers are the ones who generate value in production, not lenders or capital owners. Capital, while useful in the production process, is not the cause of wealth creation. Workers are the ones who produce goods and services, and capital simply acts as a means that facilitates this process, but does not generate it. Instead of capital paying interest, it is the labor of workers that generates the wealth that is then distributed, with part of that wealth going to lenders as interest, without them having directly contributed to production. Land ownership as the fundamental cause of interest. George goes a step further and explains that the cause of interest is not capital, but the monopoly of land. Interest derives from private ownership of natural resources, especially land. Lenders and landowners are not earning profits from productive labor but are earning non-productive profits simply by owning limited resources, such as land. Landowners and capitalists receive a portion of the value generated by workers without having done any work. George argues that interest is a product of land ownership, as this ownership allows landowners and lenders to benefit from rent without contributing to the production process. In a system where natural resources and land are collectively owned, or at least where access to land is more equitable, interest would be much lower, or even non-existent. Interest and financial speculation. George also critiques how interest has turned into a form of speculation in the capitalist system. Instead of being a legitimate payment for the use of capital in production, interest has in many cases become financial speculation, where lenders earn profits without assuming productive risks. This happens because, rather than investing in the production of goods and services, lenders simply lend money and receive compensation for the use of their capital without being involved in the risks or efforts associated with creating value. This speculation, according to George, creates a disconnect between the productive process and the accumulation of wealth. Speculators and landowners grow rich without contributing to the actual economic process, while workers, the true creators of wealth, see their share of that wealth absorbed by interest. The law of interest, an exploitation of labor. The law of interest, according to George, is not a natural economic law that arises from competition and the market, but a form of exploitation in the capitalist system. Interest is a mechanism by which the labor of workers is appropriated by resource owners. Capital, being controlled by a few, is used as a means to extract value from the working class without participating in the productive process. George sees interest as an unfair transfer of wealth from workers to landowners and capitalists. Although capital is used in the production process, most of the value generated by workers is appropriated by those who own the capital, without having worked to create it. This form of exploitation generates economic inequality in which the rich benefit from the productivity of the poor. The solution: land rent tax. The solution George proposes to eliminate interest as a form of non-productive exploitation is a profound reform in land ownership and a tax on land rent. This tax would redistribute the wealth generated by workers and eliminate the non-productive rent that landowners and lenders receive simply for owning natural resources. If workers had access to land and natural resources, they could generate wealth independently, without having to depend on capitalists for employment. By redistributing resources, a more equitable society would be created, where profits would not come from the exploitation of labor, but from production and collective effort. Chapter conclusion. In this chapter, Henry George reinforces his critique of interest as a form of exploitation and explains how interest is not the result of productive investment but rather the result of land ownership and the possession of limited resources. Interest is a non-productive profit that benefits landowners and capitalists without them actively participating in value creation. George's proposed solution is a tax reform in which a tax on land rent would be imposed to redistribute resources and allow all individuals to access natural resources. This reform would not only eliminate false interest but also enable a more just distribution of wealth and a more prosperous and equitable economy for all. Chapter 15. The Law of Wages. In this chapter, Henry George addresses the concept of wages and presents his view on how they should be determined in a fairer economy. Through his critique of traditional wage theory, George argues that wages are not simply the result of the supply and demand for labor, as often suggested in classical economics, but are strongly influenced by the system of land ownership and access to natural resources. The traditional view of wages. Classical economic theory, influenced by economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, holds that wages are the result of the interaction between the supply of labor and the demand for labor in the market. According to this view, when there is a large supply of labor, i.e., many workers available, and little demand for labor, wages tend to decrease, and when the supply of labor is scarce, wages tend to rise. This is the basic theory that justifies wage fluctuations in a market economy. Furthermore, according to classical economists, wages are influenced by the available capital. It is argued that capital is necessary to pay workers' wages, as entrepreneurs need to invest in means of production, such as machinery and tools, for workers to produce goods. The greater the available capital, the higher wages can be, as higher productivity can be generated. Henry George's critique of traditional theory. George challenges this traditional view of wages by asserting that wages do not simply depend on capital or the supply and demand for labor, but are directly related to the distribution of land and natural resources. According to George, the current capitalist system allows a few landowners and capitalists to enrich themselves through the exclusive control of land ownership, while workers, who produce the wealth, are forced to work for low wages. George argues that the true factor determining workers' wages is not the amount of available capital or labor competition, but access to land. Workers who do not have access to land must sell their labor to capitalists and landowners, who control essential resources. This creates a dependency relationship, where workers cannot improve their working conditions unless they have access to natural resources to produce on their own. Fair wages and land ownership. According to George, a fair wage for workers should be determined by the value they generate through their labor. However, due to the concentration of land ownership, workers do not have access to the resources needed to produce independently, which forces them to sell their labor to capitalists and landowners. A fair wage, according to George, should be one that allows workers to cover their basic needs and have the opportunity to prosper. However, in a system where land and resources are concentrated in the hands of a few, wages remain low because workers must accept whatever employers offer, as they have no access to other means of production. The law of wages and land rent. George directly links the law of wages with the law of rent. According to him, land rent is a non-productive profit that landowners receive without having contributed to the production process. This rent is not the result of labor or capital, but of owning a scarce resource that allows landowners to charge workers for the use of land. Since workers do not have access to land, they are forced to accept the low wages offered by employers. Land rent, like interest and rent on other resources, is a form of exploitation because it allows landowners to earn income without contributing to the production process. This exploitation of workers through low wages and land rent perpetuates economic inequality and limits workers' opportunities to improve their situation. The solution: land ownership reform. The solution George proposes is a reform in land ownership. According to him, if workers had direct access to natural resources, they could generate wealth independently and would not have to depend on capitalists and landowners for a wage. This would eliminate the exploitative relationship and allow workers to receive a fair wage for the value they generate. George proposes implementing a land rent tax, which would redistribute the wealth generated by land and natural resources. This tax would eliminate land rent and allow for a more equitable distribution of resources, giving workers the opportunity to access land and improve their wages. This reform, according to George, would increase productivity and improve workers' living conditions. Wages and social justice. George also emphasizes that the current capitalist system is not only inefficient but also unjust. In an economy based on private land ownership, workers must work harder to earn less, while landowners and capitalists receive income without directly contributing to the production process. This unjust distribution of wealth is one of the main causes of poverty and social inequality. The reform George proposes seeks to correct this injustice by ensuring that workers can access the natural resources they need to produce and generate wealth. by allowing workers access to land and resources, exploitation would be eliminated, and the well-being of society as a whole would improve. Chapter Conclusion. In this chapter, Henry George explains how workers' wages are linked to the distribution of land and how the ownership of natural resources largely determines labor conditions. George challenges traditional wage theories, arguing that wages are not solely dependent on the supply and demand for labor, but on the possession of natural resources and access to land. George proposes a deep reform of the economic system that would allow workers to access land and natural resources. This would not only improve workers' wages but also contribute to a more just distribution of wealth, creating a more equitable and prosperous society for all. Chapter 16. Correlation of the laws of distribution. In this chapter, Henry George explores the correlation between the various economic laws governing the distribution of wealth. Throughout his work, George has discussed the law of rent, the law of interest, and the law of wages, and now focuses on how these laws are interconnected and how together they determine the unequal distribution of resources in society. For George, these laws are not isolated phenomena but form a coherent system that favors a few and perpetuates poverty and the exploitation of the working classes. The interdependence of the laws of distribution. George begins this chapter by highlighting that the laws governing the distribution of wealth, such as the law of rent, the law of interest, and the law of wages, are closely connected. Each of these laws not only influences the distribution of wealth, but also depends on the others to fully understand the inherent injustice of the capitalist economic system. The law of rent, as explained earlier, establishes that land rent is a non-productive income derived from land ownership, without contributing to the production process. Landowners receive a significant portion of the wealth that workers produce without having participated in the productive process. The law of interest, on the other hand, reflects how lenders and capitalists earn passive profits through the control of capital, without needing to contribute directly to the production process. Interest is not linked to effort or the creation of real value. It is simply the result of controlling financial resources. The law of wages explains how workers receive low wages despite being the true creators of value in the economy. Wages are not determined by the value created by labor, but are influenced by limited access to resources and labor competition, largely determined by the control of land and other resources. George argues that when these laws are combined, they create a system where inequality and exploitation are structural. The working classes are trapped in a situation where they must sell their labor to capitalists and landowners, who control natural resources and capital. As a result, workers do not receive the full value they generate, as a significant portion of that value is extracted by landowners as rent and by capitalists as interest. Land control as a central element. One of the most important conclusions George draws in this chapter is that land control is the central factor underlying the laws of distribution. Access to land determines not only workers' wages but also the interest that lenders can charge and the rents that landowners can obtain. The concentration of land ownership in the hands of a few creates an economic system in which workers, lacking access to resources, are forced to sell their labor at low prices. George emphasizes that as land control becomes concentrated, the wealth generated by workers does not reach them directly but is diverted to the owners of natural resources and capitalists, who do not directly contribute to the production process. This system creates a perpetual transfer of wealth from workers to landowners and capitalists. The law of rent and its impact on wages. George also underscores how the law of rent directly affects wages. In his analysis, workers' wages are not simply the result of supply and demand in the labor market, but are linked to land distribution. When land is in the hands of a few landowners, workers cannot produce independently, as they must pay rent to access land. This reduces the value that workers can generate through their own efforts and, consequently, lowers wages. The concentration of land ownership forces workers to accept low wages due to their lack of access to resources, and the rent extracted by landowners further reduces workers' share of the benefits generated by their own labor. Interest and rent, the double obstacle for workers. A crucial point George makes in this chapter is how land rent and interest act together as two obstacles for workers. Rent is the income that landowners receive without contributing to productive labor, and interest is the income that lenders receive for controlling capital. According to George, both concepts are not legitimate results of production, but forms of speculative profit that extract wealth without contributing to the creation of goods and services. Therefore, workers not only face competition in the labor market but also must contend with the demands of landowners and lenders, who extract a significant portion of the wealth that workers generate. The distribution of resources is such that workers have no choice but to accept unfavorable working conditions and low wages, as they do not have access to the means of production. Proposed reforms: land tax and resource redistribution. The solution George proposes is, as in other chapters, a reform in land ownership. To correct the distortions in wealth distribution, it is necessary to implement a tax on land rent, which would redistribute resources and allow workers access to the means of production. This land rent tax would also allow for a more equitable distribution of resources, eliminating the barriers that landowners and lenders have created by monopolizing land and capital ownership. By distributing land more equitably, workers would be given the opportunity to generate wealth independently, which would increase wages and improve their living conditions. Chapter conclusion. The chapter concludes with George reaffirming that the laws of distribution, such as the law of rent, the law of interest, and the law of wages, are deeply interconnected and that the true cause of economic inequality lies in the concentration of land and natural resource ownership. The reform he proposes, which involves redistributing land and taxing land rent, would allow workers to have access to natural resources and ensure that wages are truly based on the value created by human labor. This reform would not only correct the inherent injustices of the capitalist system but also foster a more just and equitable economic development, where all individuals would have the opportunity to improve their living conditions through productive labor. Chapter 17. Explanation of the problem. In this chapter, Henry George summarizes and explains in clearer and more concise terms the central problem he has been developing throughout his work: economic inequality and poverty within the capitalist system. George explains how the laws of distribution, the law of rent, the law of interest, and the law of wages work together to perpetuate an unjust system in which workers produce wealth, but landowners and capitalists extract much of that wealth without contributing to the productive process. George addresses how the concentration of land and capital in the hands of a few is the key factor that creates economic inequality and perpetuates the exploitation of workers. Through this analysis, he provides a clear vision of why traditional solutions do not address the underlying problem and proposes the need for reform in the land ownership system. The origin of inequality. George begins by explaining that the central problem of poverty and inequality does not lie in the scarcity of resources, as many economists have suggested, but in how those resources are distributed. Despite humanity's great increase in productive capacity through technology and labor, a significant portion of the wealth generated by workers is transferred to landowners and capitalists through rent and interest. The concentration of land ownership and natural resources creates an unjust structure where owners, who have not contributed to the productive process, can extract rent from workers who do not have access to the resources needed to produce independently. George argues that land ownership is the core of this problem, as workers do not have access to the means of production and must pay rent in order to work. The false belief in scarcity. One point George emphasizes in this chapter is how many traditional economic theories wrongly assume that poverty and inequality are inevitable due to the scarcity of resources. According to this view, the population continues to grow while resources, especially land, do not grow at the same rate, leading to scarcity and poverty. George refutes this idea, arguing that there is no real scarcity of natural resources. Rather, scarcity is artificially created by the exclusive control of these resources by a small elite. The true cause of poverty and inequality, according to George, is not the lack of resources, but the unequal access to them. In a society where everyone had equal access to land and natural resources, poverty could be eradicated, and workers would receive higher wages and better working conditions. Land ownership, the core of the problem. George reaffirms that the main problem of economic inequality is land ownership. The concentration of land in the hands of a few landowners creates an explosive system of inequality. Landowners receive rent simply for owning a scarce resource, while workers must sell their labor to access the resources needed to produce and survive. Land rent is a non-productive income that is not tied to labor or capital but to the simple possession of land. The capitalist system and exploitation. George argues that the current capitalist system is designed to protect the interests of landowners and capitalists while exploiting workers. Labor is the source of all wealth, but workers do not receive all the wealth they generate. A significant portion of that wealth is absorbed by landowners who do not contribute to the productive process but simply benefit from owning a scarce resource. In capitalism, lenders and capitalists also play a role in this system of exploitation. Lenders receive interest on the capital they lend, despite not contributing directly to wealth creation. The ownership of land and control of capital allow the wealthy to benefit from the labor of others without participating in the production process, which perpetuates inequalities and limits workers' opportunities to prosper. The need for profound reform. The solution George proposes is a radical reform in the land ownership system. If workers had access to land, they could generate wealth independently and would not have to rely on capitalists or landowners for wages. To achieve this reform, George suggests a tax on land rent, which would redistribute wealth more equitably and allow workers access to natural resources. The impact of the reform: prosperity for all. By redistributing land and eliminating the rent that landowners receive without contributing to the productive process, the wealth generated by workers could remain in the hands of the workers, improving their living conditions and increasing their purchasing power. This reform would not only benefit workers but also strengthen the economy overall, as resources would be distributed more efficiently and the barriers that currently prevent workers from accessing natural resources would be eliminated. The key to solving the problem: economic justice. George concludes the chapter by saying that the key to solving the problem of poverty and inequality lies in the more equitable redistribution of resources. Land ownership is the central factor that perpetuates inequality, and a reform in the ownership system would allow workers to access land and participate more equitably in the economic process. The solution is not to limit population growth or address resource scarcity, but to redistribute wealth in a way that all individuals have access to the resources needed to generate wealth. By ensuring equitable access to land and natural resources, a more just and prosperous society could be created, where workers receive the full value of their labor and poverty is eradicated. Chapter 18. Dynamic Forces Still to be Explored. In this chapter, Henry George addresses the dynamic forces that, according to him, have yet to be fully understood or harnessed by traditional economic theory. These forces, which include human potential and technological progress, have a significant impact on wealth creation and social well-being. George explores how these forces can be channeled toward a more just and productive economic model through land redistribution and equitable access to natural resources. Human potential, the driving force of the economy. George begins the chapter by arguing that one of the most powerful and unexplored dynamic forces in the economy is human potential. While traditional economic theories often emphasize material factors and resource limitations, George argues that human labor and its capacity for innovation are what truly drive the economy. Social and economic progress has been made possible through humanity's intellectual capacities and creativity. Throughout history, humankind has used its intelligence to improve living conditions, increase productivity, and create new forms of social organization. This human capacity has not been adequately valued by economic theory, which tends to focus on resource scarcity rather than the limitless possibilities of human creativity. Technological progress, a catalyst for change. Another dynamic force George highlights is technological progress. Humanity's history has shown that technology can completely transform economic conditions. Technological innovations have allowed humans to produce more goods with less effort, resulting in a widespread increase in wealth. However, George observes that technological progress can also be wasted or poorly distributed in a system where resources, especially land, are concentrated in the hands of a few. Despite technological advances, workers continue to struggle for decent wages and access to the resources they need to thrive. The unequal control of resources is what limits the potential that technology and human creativity can generate in terms of social well-being. The mismatch between progress and distribution. George emphasizes that one of the great mismatches in the capitalist economy is that progress and technological advancement are not equitably distributed. While humanity has reached higher levels of production and increased the availability of goods, much of this wealth remains concentrated in the hands of a few. This mismatch between progress and the distribution of wealth creates inequality and poverty, as workers who generate the wealth do not receive a fair share of it. Technological progress has allowed for the creation of more abundance, but this abundance is not distributed equally because access to natural resources and means of production continues to be limited by the control of land and capital. The structural inequality of the capitalist system is what prevents the dynamic forces of innovation and labor from leading to general prosperity. The role of land in social dynamics. Once again, George focuses his argument on land ownership as the central factor that limits the use of these dynamic forces. According to George, the concentration of land ownership prevents human and technological forces from producing a better distribution of wealth. Landowners who control large tracts of land can extract rent from workers without contributing to the production process, creating a system of inequality. If land ownership were more equitably distributed, George argues that workers would have access to the resources needed to utilize their human potential and leverage technological progress to improve their living conditions. Access to land would allow workers to generate wealth independently and participate more actively in value creation. This would contribute to a better distribution of resources and, consequently, greater well-being for all. The need for reform to unlock potential. George argues that the dynamic forces of humanity and technology can only be fully harnessed if the land ownership system is changed. Land redistribution through a land rent tax and greater accessibility to natural resources would allow workers to unlock their potential and use existing technologies to improve production and generate greater prosperity for everyone. In this way, George suggests that a deep reform in the economic system is crucial for the dynamic forces of humanity and technological progress to create a more just and equitable society. Only through a more equitable distribution of resources can the potentials of human and technological progress be unlocked. The promise of a just society. George concludes this chapter by reaffirming that the reform of land ownership is key to unlocking the dynamic forces that already exist in society. Through this reform, workers would be able to access the resources necessary to harness their creativity and technological advancements. This would not only improve workers' living conditions but also strengthen the economy by generating greater productivity and overall prosperity. The shift toward a more equitable society would not only benefit workers, but it would also release the human potential of the entire society, promoting a more sustainable, efficient, and just economy for all. Chapter 19. Population Growth and Wealth Distribution. In this chapter, Henry George examines the relationship between population growth and wealth distribution, a central theme in his work, as many economists have suggested that population growth is an inevitable cause of poverty and resource scarcity. George refutes this idea, arguing that it is not population growth that causes poverty, but how natural resources and wealth are distributed in society. The traditional theory of population growth. The classical theory of population growth, influenced by Malthus, holds that population growth leads to resource scarcity. According to this theory, since the population grows exponentially while resources such as land and food grow only linearly, this discrepancy would lead to an overpopulation crisis, with food shortages and a degradation of quality of life. Malthus, in particular, argued that the human population would double rapidly if not controlled, while resources could not keep pace. According to this approach, poverty, hunger, and misery were considered inevitable due to the natural laws of supply and demand for resources in the face of continuous population growth. George's refutation: poverty does not come from population growth. George refutes this theory by stating that population growth is not the cause of poverty or resource scarcity. For him, the real cause of poverty and inequality is the unequal distribution of land and natural resources. Although the population may grow, it will always be possible to ensure a dignified and abundant life for all, as long as everyone has access to land and the productive resources needed to generate wealth. The structural inequality created by the concentration of land ownership in the hands of a few is what limits the potential for economic growth and wealth creation. The fact that landowners control natural resources means that workers must pay high rents to access land, which reduces the share of wealth they can receive in exchange for their labor. Land as a source of wealth. At this point, George once again emphasizes the importance of land ownership. Land, being a limited and essential resource for production, is the main obstacle preventing workers from accessing the means of production. If all individuals had access to land, as occurs in a more equitable economy, they could generate wealth without having to depend on capitalists or landowners for work. George explains that the problem is not the quantity of resources, but how they are distributed. Natural resources are abundant, but inequality in their distribution artificially creates scarcity, as only a minority controls most of the productive resources. This unequal distribution is what causes poverty, not population growth. Access to land as the solution. George proposes that, to solve the problem of poverty and ensure general well-being, it is essential to provide workers with access to natural resources. Instead of trying to limit population growth, as Malthus proposed, the solution lies in redistributing land more equitably. George advocates for a system where land rent is taxed to redistribute resources. This system would ensure that land is not only accessible to those who can afford to pay high rents but would also guarantee that the wealth generated by the land benefits society as a whole, not just a few landowners. Technology and productivity in relation to population growth. George also argues that technological progress has allowed humanity to overcome the natural limitations of land. With advancements in agriculture, manufacturing, and technology, the productive capacity of land and natural resources has increased significantly. These advances allow for much more efficient production of goods and food, so that even with population growth, humanity can be adequately sustained. Technological progress, combined with equitable access to land, would make it possible for more people to live dignified lives and actively participate in wealth creation. Workers would be able to produce more with less effort, without being subjected to the exploitation of landowners or capitalists. The Malthusian fallacy of resource scarcity. George reinforces his point that population growth does not cause resource scarcity. Although Malthus's theory predicted that population growth would lead to a crisis of scarcity, historical facts and technological advancements prove otherwise. Humanity has surpassed resource limits thanks to more efficient land use and technological innovation. The real obstacle to equitable wealth distribution is the concentration of land in the hands of a few. If everyone could access land, there would be no reason for population growth to lead to scarcity, as resources would be distributed fairly and efficiently. Conclusion of the chapter. In this chapter, Henry George dismantles Malthus's theory of population growth and resource scarcity, arguing that the true cause of poverty is the unequal distribution of land. Despite population growth, it is always possible to ensure an abundant and prosperous life for all, as long as access to natural resources is equitable. George proposes that the solution to economic problems does not lie in limiting the population but in reforming land ownership and allowing workers access to natural resources. By redistributing land and taxing land rent, it would ensure that everyone has the same opportunities to generate wealth, thus eliminating poverty and promoting a more just society. Chapter 20: Technology and Wealth Distribution. In this final chapter, Henry George examines the crucial role that technology plays in wealth distribution. Throughout his work, he has argued that land ownership is the central cause of economic inequality, but in this chapter, he focuses on how technological progress has impacted both the production of wealth and the way that wealth is distributed among society's members. Technological progress as a driver of wealth creation. George begins by highlighting that technological progress is one of the main drivers of wealth production in modern economies. Technological innovations have increased the productivity of land, industry, and services, creating more goods and services with less effort and resources. This increase in productive capacity is one of the reasons why global wealth has grown significantly, especially in recent decades. However, George points out that although technology has allowed for increased production of goods and services, the distribution of this wealth remains unequal due to property structures and how natural resources, especially land, remain concentrated in the hands of a few. Technology and productive efficiency. The misalignment with wealth distribution. George's argument in this chapter is that despite advances in technology and productive efficiency, wealth distribution remains unequal because fundamental resources, land, are unequally distributed. While technological progress has increased the production of goods, this increase does not translate into a better distribution of wealth because the upper classes still control essential natural resources, while the working class has no access to them. This misalignment between technological progress and wealth distribution generates poverty and exploitation. Technology alone cannot solve inequality in wealth distribution, as landowners and capitalists continue to accumulate rents and interest, while the workers who actually create wealth receive low wages. For George, technology is merely a tool that, if used properly, could enhance general prosperity. However, current economic structures prevent everyone from benefiting from these advancements. The role of land in wealth distribution. George once again emphasizes that the central issue of unequal wealth distribution lies in land control. Land is the fundamental resource that determines access to the means of production. As technology enables greater productivity from the land, landowners benefit from increases in land rent, while workers still lack access to the resources that generate value. Land ownership remains a major obstacle for workers to access resources and fully participate in wealth creation. Without access to land, workers must depend on the low wages paid by capitalists and landowners in exchange for their labor, perpetuating economic inequality. Technology and change in society. Although George acknowledges that technological progress has transformed the economy and improved the quality of life for many people, he also points out that technology alone cannot solve economic inequality. Land redistribution remains essential to ensuring that all members of society benefit from economic progress. Without a reform in the property system, technological advances only serve to accumulate wealth in the hands of a few. George argues that technological progress should be accompanied by social and economic reform that allows everyone to access the productive resources needed to improve their living conditions. This reform would involve a fair tax system based on a land rent tax, which would redistribute wealth and allow workers to access natural resources. The solution: redistribution of natural resources. The reform proposed by George is a redistribution of natural resources, especially land, so that all members of society can access it and generate wealth independently. This would eliminate the barriers preventing workers from accessing the means of production and allow them to work more productively, benefiting society as a whole. By redistributing the land and implementing a land rent tax, landowners would stop extracting wealth without contributing to the productive process. This would allow workers to receive fair wages for their labor, and the resources generated by work would be more equitably distributed, leading to a more prosperous society. Conclusion of the chapter. In this chapter, Henry George reiterates that technology is a powerful force that can transform the economy and increase production. But without a reform in land distribution, economic progress will not lead to general prosperity. To achieve a just and equitable society, it is essential to redistribute land and ensure that all workers have access to natural resources. This would not only improve the living conditions of workers, but also allow technological progress to benefit society as a whole, rather than just a few landowners and capitalists. Thus, we reach the end of Henry George's Progress and Poverty. Throughout this work, we have explored how economic inequalities and poverty are not inevitable consequences of population growth or resource scarcity, but rather the result of an unequal land ownership system and the concentration of natural resources in the hands of a few. George proposes a fundamental reform in wealth distribution through a land rent tax, which would ensure more equitable access to resources, eliminating the barriers that perpetuate the exploitation of workers and promoting a more just and prosperous society for all. If you are interested in this analysis and want to continue learning about the great ideas that transform our economy and society, subscribe to the Audio Mentors channel. Here, you will find more audiobooks and educational content on economics, history, philosophy, and much more to continue expanding your knowledge and worldview. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to like and share this audiobook with those who are also seeking change towards a more equitable society. See you in the next audiobook.